Hi there. Today we are going to be taking a look at lesson 17, part 1. This is Darwin's theory of evolution. So here's Charles Darwin, Chuck. He is considered the father of evolution. He was alive from 1809 to 1875 during the height of the British colonial period. This was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And some new ideas that were circulating in science were things like binomial nomenclature, principles of geology, some of these concepts that were new at the time. Some other scientists influenced Charles Darwin's thinking. So, again, we've talked about this before. Science is not on an island. Scientists work together collaboratively to develop and research new ideas. And when a scientist does make a discovery, it's and her responsibility to publish this discovery for other scientists to review and corroborate and support. So that's how those ideas grow and change. So scientists who were influencing Charles Darwin's thinking were James Hutton, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, Thomas Malthus, and Charles Lyell. Some of these you may have heard of in like a history class. I'm not sure. All right, so Lamarck had some ideas related to how organisms change over time. He was trying, but he really was way off. The only reason we still talk about him is because of the way that he influenced Darwin. So he felt like organisms were able to change simply because they wanted to. They had an inborn urge to better themselves and become more fit for their environment. He felt that there was a use and disuse. Lamarck felt as though there was a use and disuse change that could occur if certain body parts weren't used enough. And he thought that you could pass these acquired traits onto your offspring. So things that you were able to make changes in yourself, you were able to pass on to your offspring. So his idea was kind of like, if you're a giraffe and you can't reach these leaves, if you just want to enough, your neck is going to grow. And then your offspring will also have a long neck. And that really wasn't the case at all. But he did start to identify that characteristics change over generations, many, many generations later. But it wasn't a use or disuse kind of situation there. So we'll come back to him. Charles Lyell was the father of geology or uniformitarianism, which is a geological process that we see today that really talks about how Earth's geological features change over time. The processes that we see today are the same ones that shaped the earth millions of years ago. So if you look at the smooth pebbles in a stream, you and I know that the water has eroded those and smoothed those down over a really long period of time. So Charles Lyell said, if this can happen, if we're watching this happen now, this must have been the same process that happened millions of years ago. And so, because of this thinking about the earth changing slowly over time, Chuck here was like, I wonder if living organisms changed slowly over time too. All right, a little bit more about Charles Lyell's sedimentary rock studies. He found little fossils towards these lower levels, and we could conclude that older fossils down here are older than ones that were found in the more recent layers of sedimentary rock. James Hutton also was involved in the geological study of the Earth, and he concluded that the Earth must be more than just a few thousand years old, which was originally assumed, but maybe millions, maybe billions of years old. And this got people pretty angry, and you can imagine why. The commonly accepted belief was that the earth was just a couple thousand years old, right? Okay. All right. And then finally, Thomas Malthus. This is pretty controversial even today. He has done a lot of research with population sizes, and in ecology, you'll see this graph again, but it's referring to the carrying capacity of an ecosystem. And Thomas Malthus theorized that when populations grow exponentially, meaning they just double and double and double, it's a J shaped curve on a graph. When populations grow exponentially, they eventually are going to run out of resources. Okay, too many fish in the fishbowl, not enough food, waste starts to build up, disease starts to spread, and then all the fish die, right? So that's kind of Malthus's idea. And he said that when a population exceeds its resources, the population will begin to die off until reasonable numbers are reached. And so this is kind of like an ecological perspective that was applied in Charles Darwin's thinking when he was doing some research there. All right, so binomial system of nomenclature was also going on at the time. And what this involved is binomial means to name, system of naming stuff. So that's what binomial system of nomenclature means, to name, system of giving stuff names. So if we look at these two lilies, these lily flowers here, this is Lilium buiabiferum, and this is the Lilium canadense. And so this is its genus name and then the species name. So these are two different species of lily, both of the same genus. And you can see they have a first and last name. The genus name is always capitalized, the species name is lowercase, and they are put in italics. All right, so what is the genus and species name for humans? Our genus is Homo, and our species name is Sapien. So humans are Homo sapien, and then we italicize it, and that is how we write that. Okay. All right, so back to Chuck. Charles Darwin joined a 5-year expedition on board the HMS Beagle to map the coast of South America. And HMS stands for Her Majesty's Ships. The Beagle set sail to create a map of the South American coast. And if you observe, there's something missing from this map, which meant they had to go the long way around the coast. And if you said Panama Canal, you are correct. The Panama Canal had not been created yet. So he spent 5 years aboard this boat, and he was studying organisms and little creatures on the Galapagos Islands. Do I have my Galapagos Island slide in here? Yeah, here we go. The Galapagos Islands is a small cluster of little islands off the coast of South America. And he was observing different species there. They spent a little extra time. He was like, can we spend some extra time on the island? Because I'm really enjoying watching all these finches and the tortoises. And so he was observing the organisms on the Galapagos Islands, and he came up with some pretty significant observations. His first observation has to do with overproduction. He observed that species produce more offspring than the environment can support. Variation deals with the fact that individual organisms demonstrate variation. Look around your house. There's some variation there. You might not look like an identical clone of your siblings. People have different eye colors, different hair colors, different heights. Adaptation. Some variations give organisms a survival advantage. Organisms who do not have favorable variations and cannot survive in their environment, they end up dying. And then inheritance of traits. Those with favorable variations pass these traits on to their offspring. This is also known as descent with modification. So this is a little bit different from the Lamarck idea of use or misuse, or being able to change your um, your characteristics that are passed on simply because you want to. It really does have to do with, do you have characteristics that enable you to best survive in your environment? So, members of the population have traits that can be inherited. More individuals are born than the environment can support. This leads to an overpopulation or a struggle for survival. Some individuals have adaptive characteristics that enable them to survive and reproduce better. You may have heard of survival of the fittest. And then finally, an increasing number of individuals in succeeding generations have these adaptive characteristics, and this is referred to as natural selection. So Darwin took these observations and all of his data, and he wrote a really long essay, which is called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, published in 1859. He was concerned about how the public was going to respond to his ideas. This wasn't a very popular time to go against things that people had as commonly held beliefs, and we see this, all the time still. His initial wish was to have his work published posthumously, which is after his death. He didn't want the controversy of his ideas to impact his family. He didn't want people making fun of his kids and all that stuff. So he wanted his work published after his death. But his friends convinced him that this was really important. And as a scientist, like we said at the beginning, a scientist's job when they make new discoveries is to publish those discoveries so they can be further researched and further corroborated by other scientists. So he did publish his work, and things weren't great. Things weren't great for Chuck. He got a lot of feedback, a lot of flack for going against what was commonly held beliefs, particularly among members of the religious community. All right. So the big takeaway here was natural selection. Through his observations made in the Galapagos Islands, Charles Darwin formulated a theory of how species change over time called natural selection, or nature selecting for traits that are more beneficial. Natural selection is governed by the principles of genetics. The change in a frequency of a gene in a given population leads to a change in a population and may result in the emergence of a new species. That's called speciation. Natural selection does not happen overnight, guys. It happens on populations over many, 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 many generations. If we take a look at some of his observations, he observed the beaks of finches. In Darwin's finches, you can see they have some similarities. Like they're all finches. And honestly, if I saw these birds in a tree somewhere, I'd be like, look at all the birds. Like I don't know the difference between one finch and another. They're pretty. But he was really taking a close look at these beaks, and he said, the birds that were on one of the islands were more adaptive for eating seeds, and others were more adaptive for getting nectar, and others were more adapted for eating insects. And, these beaks were ideal for the conditions that they lived on. So he really started to think about how these organisms were able to change over many, 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 many generations, because if they were born with adaptive characteristics that enabled them to survive better in their particular environment, those characteristics were then passed on to their offspring. And then over time, that population is going to change in its phenotype, in its phenotypic representation of its beaks. So, natural selection is a change in successive generations of organisms due to random mutation and changes in the organism's surrounding. Can't go through a lesson on evolution without talking about peppered moths. So these moths were primarily light in color. And what had happened during the Industrial Revolution, some soot is landing on these trees and making the trees darker, not because of evolution, but because of pollution. So what had occurred was a variation among the peppered moths. Some were light in color, some were dark in color, and I'll go back and show you the picture of the actual moths. I do have a picture here of them, but some were light in color, some were dark in color. And the ones that were darker were able to blend in with this new sooty tree branch. So if we're thinking about this selective pressure or this environmental pressure that's being placed on the moths, the birds were not able to see the dark colored ones. They were blending in. So the dark colored moths, that variation, it's just like people with different hair color. The dark colored moths were able to blend into their environment, and the light colored moths started getting eaten by predators before they had the chance to pass these characteristics on to their offspring. So the dark colored moths are living their best lives and having babies, and the light colored moths are getting eaten. So you can imagine, after many, many, many generations, as we look and study these trees with the moths, there's more dark colored ones there because they had characteristics that enabled them to survive. There's natural selection in action. Your job right now is to watch our dear friends, the Amoeba Sisters, just go over natural selection with you in a little bit more detail. You don't need to take your Chapter 17 quiz yet, because tomorrow we're going to take a look at Lesson 17, Part 2. Thank you for your time.